Hello, welcome to this presentation on getting started with .NET Aspire. I'm Barrett. So just to introduce myself a little bit, mostly I'm a Microsoft MVP. I do a lot of speaking, presenting. By day I'm a developer and Azure Solutions Architect. I've been a manager, I've been a teacher, and who knows, maybe doing some of this stuff again. So just kind of give a brief overview of the agenda for this presentation. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about orchestration in general. Then I'm going to talk about .NET Aspire specifically and what it does. And we'll go over some of the tooling and then get into some demonstrations on making Aspire work, getting started and set up. And then we'll close out by talking a little bit about the process of deploying to production once you've got your Aspire application ready to go. And then a little bit about what's coming up in .NET 9 with .NET Aspire. We're just talking about orchestration in general. What is orchestration? It's basically the process of coordinating and managing multiple automation tasks. Um, maybe workflow automation, maybe process automation. But when you talk about orchestration, it's the tool sets that you use to uh, automate and work through a bunch of that stuff in larger scope. So, for example, you've got like data orchestration when you're talking about ETL tools or that kind of stuff. With DevOps orchestration, you're talking about working through setting up your pipelines, your whole workflow process from beginning to end. From checking in your code to deployment. Um, but in this case, we're talking about orchestration of applications and specifically about .NET Aspire. And Aspire itself is, it's an opinionated cloud-ready stack for building production-ready distributed applications. That's, the official Microsoft definition. It's designed to provide orchestration and to enhance the development experience to create a application that's ready to go in the cloud. It's very much focused on container-based applications, large-scale applications. But really, when you get into Aspire, you'll find that there are a lot of benefits for developing really any application. Because when you get to the point where you need to deploy it to production, yes, you can use an Aspire, and for larger applications, that's the best way to go to deploy it to Azure Container Services or Kubernetes or something like that. But there are also a lot of benefits to be had from Aspire just developing simpler applications, monolithic applications, and then deploying them the same way that you always would have before. And we can talk a little bit about that when we get into the demos later on. So, you know, what is Aspire? It doesn't replace things like containers or Redis or Kafka or your SQL Server. But what it does is it simplifies the process of linking all those pieces together. So if you have a bunch of stuff, a bunch of pieces to your application, if you have multiple APIs, if you have your Redis caches, you have your Kafka messaging, you have SQL Server or Postgres or whatever, MongoDB, whatever your database or data sources are, um, you spend a lot of time with your application configuring all that stuff, making them talk to one another. Um, what Aspire does is it handles all that for you, so that you just set it up, and it's especially if you're starting with one of their templates from the beginning. But you can apply it to pretty much anything because it'll do things like abstracting out service discovery, connection strings, your application composition, environment variables, configurations. It handles all those details for you so that you don't have to deal with them in each and every one of your projects. And that is the why of .NET Aspire. You set it up in one place, and then you put those links into your applications, and Aspire handles all that configuration back and forth, passing between the various pieces of your application. So, Aspire makes all this stuff really easy to get going, but it also includes a lot of things that help you in the development process. Like working through logging, looking at the process, stepping through, tracing the route of the code as it's moving through the application. There's a lot of bits and pieces, and as we get into the tooling and the demonstrations, you'll see that a lot more. There's a lot of pieces to it that really make your development life easier. whether or not you're going to deploy it as an Aspire application in the end or not. Um, and this isn't Microsoft's first go at orchestration. They had a project that was called Project Tie, which was kind of like the immediate predecessor to Aspire. But they've had other tools over the years. But this time, I think with Aspire, they've finally really gotten it right. So what are the requirements for .NET Aspire? So with the current version, you need to have .NET 8. You have to have a container service like Docker or Podman on your local development machine. You have to use Visual Studio or VS Code, with the C# dev extensions on it. And until .NET 9 releases, and we'll talk about that later on, you also need to download and install the Aspire workload separately. Now, as I mentioned, later on I'll mention that with .NET 9, all this Aspire stuff will be right in there with the main SDK, so you won't need to download anything additional with the next version. So the way that it handles these abstractions is through a series of NuGet packages, or Nugget if you prefer to call it that way. And you just add these packages to the various projects within your code. So here's a list of, this is the time of doing this, this is the current list of packages that are available. But they're constantly adding new stuff to Aspire. There's new things all the time. You'll notice with some of them that there's multiple packages. So, for instance, like, mostly the databases, you'll see multiple versions of things. You'll see Redis has like 3 different packages. And that's just, in some cases, they've set it up so that you use the same package in both the core Aspire application, and I'll show that one later on here in a minute. And then there's a separate package for the clients, usually. But it just depends. For some of them, you'll use the same package in both the Aspire core application as well as the client packages, so the various pieces, your API, your web app, your caching app, whatever it might be. So it's just a matter of which package is for which purpose. You'll also notice when you go out to look for these packages, all of them start with the word Aspire. So it's very easy to filter and find all the Aspire packages together. You just type in Aspire in your NuGet search, and you'll see all the Aspire packages that are available for you to install. All right, so that's enough with the slides. Let's start and get into some of the demos. All right, so got Visual Studio here. So what I'm going to do here is look for the .NET Aspire starter application. We're going to go ahead and click on that and click Next. And we'll just leave the default name Aspire App 1. Oh, okay, I guess I've already got one there. Leave the default name Aspire App here. Let's actually change that. Let's go Aspire App Demo. Click Next. So when you create an Aspire application, you'll see there's a couple options here. We'll just go ahead and leave the HTTPS on. We're going to go ahead and turn off Redis caching for now. So one of the things that it'll let you do is include Redis as part of the default, but I'm going to show you as part of the demos how to add that. So in case you want to add that manually later, and then you can add a test project or not. Let's go ahead and leave that off for now. And of course, .NET 8 is the version you use. All right, and here we see our default Aspire application. So let's kind of walk through the pieces that are over here. So a couple of things that you'll see here. There is an API application. That's your standard .NET Core API application. You also see a web application, which with the default template is a Blazor front-end application, just your standard web app. And then you'll see 2 other applications here. So there's the service defaults. I'll show you that one first. So basically what service defaults is, it just provides you with some common extensions that you can use across all of your .NET projects. So your web and your API projects. It's just things which help you get set up really easily to start with. It's adding some service defaults here, and you'll see calls to this endpoint or this function in both of the program.cs application files. It just does some standard generic things. One of the things it does is it sets up the telemetry, which helps you with getting your logging and all that set up. It also adds the default exporters for that. The telemetry uses the open telemetry standard, so that you can send the telemetry. There is a dashboard I'll show you here when we start running the application. By default, it uses the dashboard to track things, but you could send your information to App Insights or to pretty much anything that will. You can see it's got here. If you want to use App Insights, it's got that in here. Just commented in there. You just have to add your connection information. But really, any logging system that uses the Open Telemetry standards, you can use with this logging. It'll also set up the health checks by default, as well as mapping your default endpoints for those health checks and system checks. So it's just some common stuff. So really, anything that you have that's common to all of your .NET projects, you can put in here and just reference it. It's just it's another thing that they do by default to help you get going. It's completely optional. You don't have to use any of that at all. And then there's the app host project. So with .NET Aspire, this is the central core of what you're working with. This is the one that coordinates everything. And this is the application when you're running locally, and also when you deploy it as an Aspire application. This is the application that runs. This is the one that handles everything and coordinates all the activities between the various pieces. So let's start with the dependencies here. So if you look at the packages, you'll see that there's just this app host, aspire.hosting.apphost. That's really the only package that's absolutely needed at this core. As you add other pieces, and I'll show you as we do go through the demonstration and add some stuff, I'll show you how to, what packages you would add to here. But this is the central core stuff. Minimize that now. And then the program.cs. So you can see there's very little here to start with. But it provides you with so much even just to get started with this very little bit of front-end stuff. What you'll see as you go through the program and the app host is you'll see references to your other projects. So first here, it's creating a reference to the API service. So saying, okay, I'm going to add this project, and this is my API service project, and I'm going to give it a name, call it API service. And you're passing that into, or you're setting that into a variable. Then you're going to add another project. Here's our web project. I'm going to give it the name of web front end. And here you can see it's calling one of those commands from service defaults. And then it's passing a reference to your API project, to the web project. So let's start by looking at that. So we'll go over here to our program.cs in our web application. And you'll see that it's adding a client. You'll see here that name, API service. So again, going back over here, we gave it the name API service. It passes that information over here. So it goes over here as this is building and setting up. It'll look at this and say, okay, this is my API service, so that when it runs, it will get a reference to the API project and it'll pass that in here. So you don't have to do any of that configuration yourself. It's all handled for you. So you don't have to enter localhost. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You don't have to worry about the ports. It's all taken care of for you. And that is one of the joys of Aspire projects, is having all that handled for you. And then there's the rest of this is all fairly pretty standard stuff. So again, here's that map default endpoints that comes from the extensions over here in service defaults. All right. So one of the other things, if we'll just go over here and look at the programs.cs in your API, again, you can see the service defaults coming from your service defaults project here. Other than that, it looks like a standard, demo API project that would get set up for you. Let's go ahead and run that application. So again, the app host is the project that runs. It's the startup project, and that handles kicking off the other applications as part of it. And I'll show you here as we get into the dashboard. So once your application is up and running, you'll be open to this dashboard. So you'll see a list of resources on the opening screen. This will show you the resources that are a part of your project. So here you can see our API project, which is called API Service, our web project, which is called Web Front End. And then, you can see various pieces of information about those if you want to open those individually. So for instance, I can click on that and it'll open the default endpoint here, which is, the demo weather information. If I want to look at my web front end here, of that, and of course, if you've ever messed around with the Blazor templates, this is very familiar to you. So you can close those. So one of the things that you'll see also with this is there are some other tabs over here. So we'll go through these one at a time. And you can also reference that information from over here. So actually, let's start with the details. Let's look at the details for our API project. You can see it gives you a bunch of information about the project right out of the box. It'll show you, what your default endpoints are, what all of your environment variables are, so you can look at those and reveal each of those, as you need to. So these are all the environment variables that you get out of the box here set up for you. Information about that. So same thing with the web front end. All that same kind of information here. And your information here. But you can also see these links have been passed in to your web project. These references to the API project. You didn't have to do anything for it. You didn't have to set up those ports. You didn't have to add those references. It's all handled for you. It's all right there. So let's go ahead and look at the console. So this is the logging information, and you can look at each of them individually. So you can see here's the logging information for the API project and for the web project. And as if I were to start going through these here, for instance, let's open the web project, go over to our weather, just refresh that a couple of times. And if we go back and look at the logs for that, you can see those calls on my web project into the API project. You can see the logs in a more structured information here, or more structured view here. You can also view the logs combined. Whereas with console, you just see the console output for each individual project. There's also the trace information. So, you've got this tracing information into each of your projects, so you can really dig into the details of what's going on as your code runs. See timings, you can see details of each view. It's just a whole ton of information that's available to you in the tracing information. And this is huge. It's really helpful as part of your development process. And then, of course, there's the metrics information here. So you can see information from your Kestrel servers, instances, your connections. You can see process information, active requests, all kinds of information that's available to you as your applications are running in your local environment. There's just a huge amount of information that's available to you as part of an Aspire project just out of the box. You don't have to do anything to set any of this up. It's all right there for you, ready to go. You just do it there. So what about, adding Aspire to an existing project? Say you've got something you've been working on. Well, it's really fairly simple as well. You would create a new project. It would be your app to serve as your app host. You would add, this app host reference here, and you can set up the program. You just start adding your references. Now we'll show you a little bit more here, but as you can see by default, your app settings.json really has nothing in it. But as you need to add configuration information, again, as I get through the demos, I'll show you some more of that. You can add it here, and the information that's in here gets passed to the various client projects. The biggest difference on adding Aspire to an existing project, that you would have to go into each of these Actually, it doesn't have any dependencies on Aspire projects here. That comes later, sorry. Yeah, the only thing you need is your app host project with that reference. Then you would just go in here to your program.cs and you would change the references in here to, for instance, uh, reference the main project. So again, with the API project, there's really nothing you need to do at this point because there's nothing added to it. But if I had configuration settings, I would move that to the central location in the app host, and it would get passed from the app host into these various client projects. And as I add like SQL Server here in these demonstrations, it'll become more apparent to you as we go through this. So it's really fairly easy, to add Aspire to an existing project as well, existing solution. So let's go on to the next step here. So, we've got our default application. It's all connected out of the box. It's got, got that great dashboard information. Let's try adding a SQL Server reference here. So, there's a couple of different ways to do it. So the first thing we're going to do here is go into our app host project. Minimize the rest of this here to avoid, kind of minimize our confusion here. And we're going to go into manage our NuGet packages here. And what we want to add is, whoops, Spire hosting SQL Server. So as I mentioned, with a lot of these things that you're going to be adding, there are multiple versions. So for the ones where they're split up, so for instance, where you have one version of the package for the hosting project, another for the client projects, you would look for the one for the hosting project would have the .hosting in the name as well. So go ahead and install that one. Okay, we've got that in there. Let's put some of this out so we get rid of some of the clutter. Go back into our program.cs file. So what we're going to do, now that we've got that in here, so first thing we need to do is add a reference to our SQL Server. Same way that we've got references to our API and our web project. Let's say var SQL equals builder.add SQL Server. We're going to give it a name. We're going to call it SQL. Then we want to give the database that we're going to add a database and give that a name. So let's add a database called Aspire App Demo. And what was it? Whoops. Go. So basically what we're telling this is add SQL Server to the project, and we're going to add a database in that project called Aspire App Demo. So that's our initial setup here in the app host project. Now let's go over to our API service. We're going to need to do several things over here, kind of get this going. So the first thing we want to do is add our entity framework reference here. Go under dependencies, and we're going to add NuGet project. Again, it's Aspire dot Microsoft.entity framework or .SQL server. You can see there's for entity framework core, there's a few different versions here. We've got for SQL Server, for Cosmos, for Postgres, for Oracle, and for MySQL. So we're going to do SQL Server. That added in. Okay. So what we need to do after this is set up our DB context and a couple of initial models. I'm not going to make you watch me do all that, so let me pause this while I add those in. Okay, so we're going to keep this really dumb and simple. So here's my DB context. I've added, a single model class of demo data item. If you go over here, look at the demo data item, you just see it's got, an ID, a name, and a description. Very simple, nothing, really fantastical or interesting about it. Go ahead and close that. So the important part is the updates we're going to make to the program.cs file here. So if you recall over here, we've created a reference to our SQL server, called a SQL, and database called Aspire App Demo. So we go over here into our program.cs for our API project, and we're going to show you how to add the references to that now. So what we're going to do is go up here to the top. Put it after that one. Say builder dot add server DB context. I'm going to call that it was fire demo DB context. Then in here, for the connection name, and this is the key part here, putting in the name of the database, Fire App Demo. Save that. And then one of the things to explain to you about this is with this version that I've added here with the just builder.add SQL server, what this does in an Aspire application is it creates a container in your local Docker instance, puts SQL Server into that container, and then adds a reference to that. But one of the things that it does not do is it does not set up your database for you. So one of the things that we need to do here is go down here towards just above our run. I'm going to say if app dot oh, I'm in the wrong one. Whoops. Not in our app host, but in our API project. Down here just before the run, we're going to do if app.environment.isDevelopment. Going to add a call to set up our database. Oops. Scope. All right, service. Context. Get a reference to our DB context, and then database ensure created. So what this will do is this will actually go into that container version of SQL Server. It will check to see if the database is created, and if not, it will create the database and add the table for the demo data item that I've created here. So got that. That should be everything that we need. Go ahead and do a build. Everything's successful, and run. What did I miss here? Oh, sorry, I gotta get my Docker instance running. I got that spinning up here. For some reason, I always forget to start my Docker desktop. Okay, so we've got our configuration set up here on the API project. Making sure our database is going to get called. So one more thing we have to do. So let's go back over here to our API service, or sorry, to our app host. And we need to give our API service a reference to our SQL. So what we're going to do is go here to our var API service equals builder.API service. And then we're going to add a reference to the SQL in there. The way we do that is we'll add another line, go dot with reference, and give it a reference to SQL. This is saying, okay, I need to pass into my API service a reference to this SQL container that we've created. Save that and run it. And what we should see as this comes up, you'll now see that instead of our 2 resources, we now have 4 resources. So we have a reference to our container running SQL Server and a reference to our database, the Aspire App Demo database. All right, so the application is up and running. It's got the reference to SQL Server. We don't have anything that's actually getting or pulling data, so let's go back to our application. Let's stop that for a moment. And let's add an endpoint here to set up some data. So make it really simple. Let me go ahead and pause it here, and I'll add some code to this. Okay, so I've added an endpoint called user groups. Just basically I create a static class to add this, so I can add a couple of endpoints here as we go through the demo here. So it's just checking to see if there's not any data in there. It'll add some data to the database, and then it'll save those changes, and then it returns the list of whatever's in that data point or whatever's in that table in the database. And of course over here I've made a call to that static function, so it adds the endpoint to the API project. So let's go ahead and run that. And you can see if I go over here to this, here's my default one is the dummy weather data here, but we'll change that here in a second. Find the initial setup takes a minute because it's checking to make sure that the database is running. So the endpoint that we added was, oh, actually from another demo. And let's change that. So data. That's what happens when you copy paste. And change almost everything, but not everything. Call that endpoint. You see the initial delay is because it's spinning up a new instance of the container with SQL Server in it, and that takes a couple minutes here. So got our demo data endpoint, so you can see it is returning the information that I created there. You can see it gave each of the items an ID, and there's the, that was part of that class that we mapped there. So SQL Server added very quickly, very easily, set up very quickly as well. Let's go ahead and stop that. Close that there. So let's go back to our app host. Let's go and add our Redis extension next. That's what we're going to do there. Go back to our app host. Let's start with the NuGet package for Redis for the app host. And what we're going to look for is aspire.hosting.redis, I believe. Yep. Install that one. So what this package will do is we add the reference to it in our project. Call it Redis here. I believe that's the correct reference. So what this will do is this will spin up an instance of Redis caching in another container in your Docker front end. And it's the same Redis instance that you can use for both your API endpoint caching as well as your web project output caching for that as well. So we'll go ahead and add that to both projects. So the first thing we want to do is add references to it. So dot with reference, not replicas, reference, and Redis. And for our web project, same thing, dot with reference Redis. So boom, we've created our instance of Redis, and we are adding references to both of our projects. Whoops, what I wanted to go back to. There we go. Added references to both of our projects to Redis so that they can make use of Redis there. Let's start with our API project. Go up here to our dependencies. And we're going to add Spire dot. Redis is one of those that actually has 3 different packages here. It's Aspire dot stack exchange. There we go. Dot Redis. And for the API project, we want to use the distributed caching. We'll add that here. We'll go into our project, and we're going to set up our distributed caching reference in here. What we want to do, we want to approach this. So up here under our SQL server, we're going to do builder dot add Redis distributed cache, and we're going to look for, we gave it the name of Redis, so it's going to look for the connection string Redis. And then what we want to do down here is we've got this weather forecast, so we want to cache that, so we want to get rid of this. Let's just comment that out. We're going to replace it with a different version. So we're going to do app.get weather forecast. We want to do distributed cache. I'll call it cache. Okay. Then into that, I'm gonna copy and paste some code here. And we want to add one more piece down here at the bottom. Okay, so what this will do is it will first check to see if there is a cached forecast in there. If there isn't, then it's going to use the same code that was up here to generate the forecast. And then it's going to save that data into the cache with an expiration date of 10 seconds. Going to return that. If it generated that, and if it didn't, then it's going to take the cached version and use JSON to format it correctly. Because when it puts it into the cache, it is not in a format that is ready to go for the return. So it's either going to generate a new forecast and return that, or it's going to return the cached forecast. So we'll demonstrate that here in a minute, but let's go ahead and add it to our web project as well. So for our web project, we're going to do something a little bit different. Up here, we want to do fire.stackexchange.redis, and for that, we're going to do output caching for our web project. So that's installed, and then let's go down here into our programs in the in the web application. And then what we're going to do up here at the top, go add it right at the very top here, do builder.add Redis output cache. And again, we're going to use our reference to Redis. That will get passed in from the app host project. And then we want to do a couple other changes here in our components homepage. I'm going to add a datetime.now. Then what we're going to do is add an attribute at the top, add the caching. Cache and give it a duration of 10 seconds. Okay. Save that. Everything. I think that's everything that we need for Redis. Go ahead and build that. Run it. So again, now you'll see that there's one more resource that's been added here to a reference to our Redis cache in the container. Let's go to our weather forecast API endpoint first. Now before, if we would refresh this, it would just give us a different output every single time. What this will do now is it will give us the same data for 10 seconds. You see as I hit refresh here, data is not changing, and boom, there it's changed. And refresh for several seconds, just refresh over and over and over and over again. After 10 seconds, we get a new set of data. So that's the weather forecast. And let's go into our web application. And you can see here we've got 4:42:40 p.m. You can see as I refresh, time only updates about every 10 seconds. Boom, 55. 4:42:55. Again, after about 10 seconds, it should go 4:43:05 or thereabouts. There you go. So you can see we've added caching very quickly, very easily to both of our API and web projects. Very simple. And let's go ahead and close that. Close down some of the stuff here. All right, so let's do one more, I think. Let's add Azure storage. That's what it is. Fire hosting Azure storage. That's the one I'm looking for. Now if I go in here, yeah, there it works now. Take a second to clear out. Okay, so now we create a reference to our storage, and then we're adding a reference to the blob. So that equals storage dot add blobs. Give it a name, blobs. Well, why not? And then we need to add one more piece of code for blob storage just to have it run on the local emulator instead of trying to actually connect it to a blob instance in Azure. So we're going to use run as emulator here. And this image tagging just, I don't remember what that does off the top of my head. Something about not worrying about versioning, I think, as I recall. Okay, so and then down here in our API, I'm going to add with reference to our blob. So again, we're going to create a local emulator with Azure Blob Storage, and then give it a reference to our API project. That is our app host setup. Then we'll go up here to our API project, and we're going to do Aspire Azure Storage Blobs. That's where this one goes. And in our program, We're going to add our reference to blob storage. We're going to do builder dot add Azure Blob Client and give it a reference to our blobs. Then what we're going to do is we need to have an endpoint map to that. We go over here to my endpoint extension. I'm going to add a piece of code for that one. Get our blobs. And again, I'm just going to copy paste here. All right, so what this piece of code here does is it creates a post endpoint for creating a container. I'm just going to give a name my container. It really doesn't matter. Then it's going to just check to make sure that the container was created correctly. If not, return failed. So that is part of what I need to do. I also need to update blob client blobs. I also need it down here. Add blob storage endpoint. So I can call my static function to actually make that endpoint active. We'll go ahead and run that. You can see my blob storage resource has been created. I've got a reference to that. And so what we want to do from here is we're going to call our API endpoint. Because this is a post call instead of a get, I need to use Postman here. So port is 7507. Put this here, change that to the correct port, 7507, and call that. And you can see that it has returned a successful message where it's created created my storage account or created my blob storage container in there. Return the name, my container, reference to that. All right, so some demos of how you can get up and running with a lot of different things with Aspire very quickly. Close that out. What I'm going to do is go back to our slides for just a couple of things here. So let's talk about production deployment. So as I mentioned, Aspire applications, at present, they are designed to focus on container apps or container-based applications. So with the built-in functionality, there are two methods of deploying to production right now. If you're going to go to Azure Container Apps, you can either use the AZD command line or command function on the command line to deploy your application, or you can do the right-click publish in Visual Studio, which basically it just calls AZD in the background, so it's really the same thing. You can also use CI/CD pipelines to deploy with either GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines. Those are options for deploying as well if you're going to Azure Container Apps. The other option that you have is if you're going to use Kubernetes as your production environment. There is a community developed and maintained application called Aspirate. It's a command line application that you can download and run it in your solution folder, and it'll create your manifest, it'll initialize it, it'll set it up, it'll create the connections for you, and it will handle the deployment to your Kubernetes environment. You just need your information for your production environment out there. So there's a couple different environments for deploying to container-based applications in production. I also mentioned that if you want to go the old way and just manually deploy each of the projects, you can do that very easily. What you really need to do there is you'll have to update the configurations yourself manually before you deploy. So you can set up for instance with the application here is when I setting this up here for is development. You can do things in here, or say if is production, then change your or if it's not development, you can change it so that it's getting different sets of configuration for each of these endpoints up here. So instead of using these, you have to use excuse me, you'll have to use you know setting up those configuration strings as you would have had to anyway. Um, it takes a bit more effort to do it that way, obviously. So it's designed out of the box to be able to deploy very easily to container applications. And if you are deploying that way, then you don't need to do anything else. It just again works out of the box. You will have to do a little bit of setup in production to make sure that your web application is publicly accessible and whatnot. And all the front end stuff there that you would have to handle. But for the most part, you really don't need to do anything else to deploy to production either. So it's very straightforward there. So you got a couple of different options. The Kubernetes support is a little. I haven't tried it myself, but I've heard that it's a little bit flaky at times with Aspirate. But supposedly that's supposed to be very much improved in the next version here. It's coming out in the next month or two with .NET 9. Actually, next month I believe that comes out as I'm recording this anyway. Um, so that's your production options. So let's talk about what's new for Aspire and .NET 9. So what we have for .NET 9 is a lot of new features that are coming for Aspire, a lot of things that are available to you. And there's actually a post that David Fowler did on Twitter, which actually explains this a lot better than I could. So let me just kind of walk through his post here. Uh, so again, he mentions you'll be able to use Aspire 9 with .NET 8 and .NET 9. You'll no longer need to call the workload, or you no longer need to install the workload to use it with .NET 9. It'll be right there in the SDK with everything else. So that'll, this, as he mentions here, that'll make your CI/CD integration a bit easier. You just need the NuGet packages. Another thing that you'll be able to do is add wait for. So right now, there are some issues where it just tries to get everything running. So for some of those services, like for instance, SQL Server in your container takes a little bit to spin up. The Redis cache takes a little bit to spin up. What you can do now is if you need to have code that's dependent on that kind of thing, you can add the wait for command, and it will wait for that to finish before it moves on. So again, a little bit of things to help you there and make your life a bit easier. The next thing he's talking about is the ability to start and stop services. So if I look at this one here, there we go, that's what I was looking for. So what there will be is a set of buttons over here that you'll be able to start, stop, and restart each of your services from the dashboard. You'll also be able to create custom buttons. So you can see the three dots there. You'll be able to create custom buttons that will let you basically do anything that you can do in C#. For good or for evil, whatever you want to do with those buttons. So you'll be able to create those buttons, have that functionality in there. Again, he mentions that here. You can expose your own commands to C#. So, for instance, clear cache is an example that he's got here. You can set that up as a button. So if you want to clear your Redis cache or whatever it might be, or your database cache, you can do that very easily with one of those buttons. And so he demonstrates how that button will appear there. So you click on that and then you get clear cache. So that's a really cool feature that's coming in version 9. Ability to make containers persist beyond the lifetime of the app. So right now, your only option is with each of these containers that it's spinning up, it creates the new container each time. This will be able to keep that container persistent. It will exist the next time you run it, so that it doesn't need to spin up a new version of it. So I mentioned, a minute ago, it takes a while to spin up some of these resources in Docker. Um, Now you don't have to, because it can maintain those from run to run for you. You can also, if you are actually already have a container, you can use an existing container. So you just give it the hitting the wrong button. So you'll be able to just give it a name and maintain that container from instance, or use that container that's already out there for you. Um, right now the names are all dynamically generated, so you can give them their own names now with version 9. So can make things a lot easier with some of that stuff. You need to work with those containers directly. There's a new eventing system that will be in there. You'll be able to subscribe to events that happen uh, within the various functionality going through there. So you'll be able to hook into those and run custom code related to any of those events that'll happen there. Um, so Azure, this is a big one here, is Azure function projects. Right now, function projects are not supported with the Spire, but that is coming with version 9, so that you'll be able to use Azure function projects, which I think is huge. Is be very useful, being able to connect those to your applications, your Aspire applications. There'll also be a SDK a container development kit that you'll be able to hook into with version 9. So there's a lot of stuff you'll be able to do with relation to Azure container systems. Now, he does mention here the syntax for this is not final as when he posted this, which was a few weeks ago. A couple weeks ago, I guess, now that he posted this one. So there's a lot of other things that are coming. One of the other things that I've read about is that the Docker support and support for other hosting environments other than Azure will be greatly improved. You can do it now, but it's a little flaky. It has some issues if you want to go to AWS or Google or wherever you want to host your application. It's a little flaky right now, but that support is supposed to be a lot better in version 9, so that'll be huge. So that's just a quick peek at a lot of the stuff that's coming up for version 9 of .NET Aspire. So I thank you for your time. I appreciate you paying attention, watching, and if you have any questions, you can or any feedback, feel free to reach out to me. The best way to get me is on LinkedIn. Um, I've grown. I mean, I do have a Twitter account, but grown somewhat tired of Twitter and its irritations. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's the best way to connect, and it's where I'm most active. And again, thank you for your time. Good day.